Hey guys, okay, before I start, I have to apologize because I've been fighting a cold for a week, so hopefully you guys can understand me. When I was looking for a topic, I decided to settle on decomposition. I wasn't quite sure how that would fit into the standards, so I went ahead and looked through those, and I found one that talked about, it said to develop a model to describe the cycling of matter and flow of energy among living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. And there was a particular core idea of this that caught my eye that had to do with decomposition. It said food webs are models that demonstrate how matter and energy is transferred between producers, consumers, and decomposers as the three groups interact within an ecosystem. So I thought that would be perfect. Decomposition is, as we know, an important part of our ecosystem, and the food webs, people might be grossed out by it, but it's an integral part of our environment. When explaining food webs to students, to ecosystems to students, we have to also explain the importance of decomposers in the way that they, recycle nutrients from dead plants or animal matter back into the soil or the water, depending on the environment. So what I decided to do is to focus primarily on worms. And what I found was the term vermicomposting. And that is the process of composting through using worms. I thought that using worms, it's something that the children can actually physically see, and the little bacteria, they can't really see that. So the worms, it's something they're familiar with, something that they can easily see with the naked eye. So I thought that would be something that would be interesting. What I did was I decided I wanted to originally look and see what the worms preferred. Did they prefer a certain amount of food over another, or, and I also wanted to make a visual observation to see how the environment changed as they decomposed the items. Excuse me. So what I did was I decided on 3 different foods. I decided to go ahead and use carrot peels, potato peels, and eggshells. And in my research, I found that these were actually items that the worms do like. So I decided to settle on those. Okay, so inside those containers, I wanted to have a very similar environment so that my data would be accurate. If I had, different ventilation in each one, and different size containers, and different amounts of worms, and different amounts of bedding, different amounts of food and waste, that wasn't going to obviously give me accurate results. So what I did was I weighed out all of the food and waste. So I had 20 grams of the carrot peels, potato peels, and eggshells. I had 100 grams of the moistened bedding, the shredded newspaper. And then I also had approximately 53 grams of worms in each. And then I went ahead and combined that into my container. So my original intent was to record which of the food waste material the worms seemed to eat more of, while also doing a visual observation to note the increase of the worm castings or vermicompost, which is the worm waste that the worms produced. I check these every 2 days took pictures and also just made a little note of the change, visual change. And I did this over a 10-day period. My original experiment didn't quite go as planned. At the 4-day mark, the worms within the eggshells all died. They were all dead. When at the 2-day mark, they seemed fine, but 4-day mark, they were dead and stinky, and it was gross. I also found that at the 8-day mark, when my experiment was almost over, suddenly the worms within the carrots were dead as well, and it was gross. So I found this to be interesting because based on my research, the worms are supposed to like carrot peels. This is supposed to be a food that they are fond of and that they eat well. So I was kind of surprised by that. Eggshells is also something that they are supposed to eat, but they didn't. The way that I came up with the amounts to put inside the containers, excuse me, was I had found that the worms are supposed to be able to consume at least half their body weight. These red worms are supposed to be able to consume at least half their body weight in this food or waste material every day. So when I measured out the food amount, I put in actually less than what the worms weighed. So my worms, were approximately 53 grams, and the food waste materials that I put in was only right around 20 grams. So in my thought process, I thought that they would be able to finish this easily. But what I found, especially like with the carrot peels, is that the carrot peels on that 8th day were rotting. They, which I'm guessing attributed to the death of the worms. My error probably in that was feeding too much food and not giving them enough time to actually break that down before it started to rot and then killed them. I'm not positive on this, but this is my guess from what I've read. Also, I thought that maybe there was a possibility that I did not break down the material enough for them to actually be able to decompose themselves, because it was bigger eggshells that I just kind of crunched, and then it was just the peels of carrots and the peels of potatoes. So when my 10-day mark came around, I didn't have anything to compare, because the only thing that still had living worms in it was my potatoes. Like I said, I had intended to separate everything and measure the food waste materials at the end of that 10-day mark to compare weights, but that wasn't possible. So I went ahead and just explored the container with the potatoes. Nothing really had changed as far as measurements like I had hoped. My worms were all alive, which was surprising since the other ones all died off, but the worms in this container were all alive. They seemed to be doing fine, but they actually weighed less, and how that happened, I'm not quite sure. I don't know if they didn't have enough food there. I'm not sure on that, why they actually weighed less. I'd figured with the food waste in there that I'd see somewhat of a change, maybe that they'd weigh a bit more after consuming, decomposing the items in there, but that wasn't the case. I actually measured the food that was in there, the potatoes, and figured I would see quite a bit of a change in that, but it only changed by 1 gram. It decreased by 1 gram, was it? But what was very noticeable was, as you could probably see from the pictures that I showed, was the increase in the vermicompost. So they were composting something, you know, they were consuming something, and something was being composted by them. It was very visual, you know, you could see that. I believe that the reasoning behind this was probably that they were actually composting the newspaper material that was in there. As I said earlier, the shredded moistened newspaper was a recommended bedding material for these worms in the vermicomposting setup. But what I had also read was that they will consume this newspaper as well. And I guess I just figured that they would go for the food instead of the newspaper, but my thought process on this was that they were actually consuming the newspaper. Let me see here. Okay, so as you can see here, there was quite a bit of I'll show some pictures here, but there was quite a bit of vermicompost, as you can see in the pictures here I'm about to show. Quite a large amount that you could see that they had processed, and this was only in 10 days. So if I were to do this in the future, there's something, you know, there's quite a few things I would likely change. You know, I don't know if I'd necessarily call it a failed experiment. I guess, you know, killing off, you know, that many worms is not my intent, but it helps me learn a lot, though, as far as what I could do in the future in my own classroom, because I think it would be a good experiment for them to do. This would likely be in a classroom. I would likely have this be an observational experiment. As it's very easy to see, you know, as you could see from the pictures, what actually took place from day 1 to day 10. And this would, you know, allow the students to make that observation pretty easily. Before I would bring my students to a point where they can actually inquire to this, I would have, you know, obviously covered decomposers, producers, and consumers, to make sure that they have an understanding of that. And then this would be an extension of that to discover, you know, to explore decomposers. I'd probably start out with, you know, talking about what happens to leaves when they fall to the ground. What happens when apples fall from the trees to the ground? What happens to animals when they die? You know, where do they go? And this is something that, you know, the students can talk about, and there's some good resource videos out there as far as decomposers that the students could watch. And that would help introduce them to that. I'd like my students to explore worms specifically, like I said. So I would probably start out, you know, after exploring decomposers and going through the videos, I would want them to actually physically look at the worms and explore them. They could easily be laid out on a moistened paper towel, and they could explore them with, you know, tweezers, magnifying glasses, things like that, and make visual observations of those and record those. I would want them to think of different items that that worms could decompose, and then help lead them to you know, the materials that worms can actually decompose, so that they have an understanding of that. I don't know if I would actually risk doing the food in the classroom with the worms, because I would hate to come back and have all the worms dead. I would hate to come back after a vacation, after a weekend, and have dead, rotting worms stinking up the classroom. So I might avoid that. You know, I'm not positive, but I don't know if I'd want to do that in my own classroom. What I would want to do is use just the newspaper bedding. Just set up the similar containers, have each, put them in groups, have each group have their own containers with the newspaper bedding and the same amount of worms, excuse me, and have them make observations every couple of days. Just make their visual observations and record those. What I could do too is, before we start this experiment, I could actually have a container with the newspaper bedding in there and leave it for 30 days. Excuse me. And then bring that into the classroom to show the students, say, hey, this is what it used to look like. Show them a picture that it was just this newspaper, shredded newspaper. This is what they did to it after 30 days. Now you're going to have your own containers. Let's see what happens in 10 days. And I think that would be an interesting experiment for them. Overall, I think this will go well as far as teaching students about decomposers, because it's very hands-on, it's very visual, so they're not just hearing me tell them, it's look at what's actually happening. This is what happens in your environment, and this is why these decomposers are so vitally important to our environment. While I had to make some changes, I learned actually quite a bit about what works, what might work, what won't work, and I think it could be a successful way to show kids this process and, again, how important our decomposers are to our environment in the ecosystem.